Welcome to Big Blend Radio, where we celebrate variety and how it adds spice to quality of life. Welcome, everyone. You know, every second Wednesday, we have our show, our authors and book show with Books Forward, and we've been working with them for about the 25 years this company has been going. They really represent some of the best in the world of publishing and writing and books. And today we have Rob Tonkin joining us to talk about his new memoir. It's called A-Hole: Wild Stories of Trauma, Truths, and Transformation. It's fun, it's honest, and you can go to his website, robtonkin.com. It's linked in the episode notes so that you can pre-order it. It does come out as an ebook July 21st, and then also after that it becomes a hard copy and an audio book, which I know a lot of my friends are going to be happy about, especially my music friends. But this is not just about music and your life in music, right?
That's
Welcome.
correct. Thank you. Thank you for having me, Linda.
This is great. When you think about, the life that you have had as, touring with musicians, being in the music industry, the radio side of it as well, that's kind of like everyone dreams of being Anthony Bourdain, right? And then we see how he still had a lot of struggles, obviously. And I was thinking about that with your book, A-Hole, and we can get to why you titled it that. But do you think that sometimes people don't see beyond the glitz and the glamour of those kind of high-profile careers?
I think that yes, I think that's a very good point in short answer. But I think that even people that are in the spotlight and people behind the scenes that are supporting those people all come with their own baggage. And that's really, this book is more about my baggage, and I do talk about some of theirs too, but I try not to speak for other people.
Right. Yeah. Everyone's got their own thing. And, I come from the music world too, and in our band and stuff, it's like when you hit the stage, all that's supposed to go away. It was kind of like your own escapement while you're performing, to not be whatever's going on in the background, to not have it there. It's kind of like you're in present moment. And I think sometimes in the world of music or even in theater, that becomes an escape. What do you think from those? I think it's healthy. It's a healthy escape.
Well, I experienced that as a young child on the radio as a DJ. I was in a very unique situation. I worked at a big radio station that was broadcasting from a little bit south of Tijuana, Mexico. And at that time, you couldn't actually get the signal separated from where the broadcast was emanating. And so your studio had to be at that location because we couldn't cross an international line. Yet the station was broadcasting in English. So it was an interesting little shack that overlooked the ocean, about a half a mile from the ocean, overlooking, nothing really. And I was very, you're alone in a little, yet you're talking to, maybe 100,000 people or more at a specific time. And that is a weird feeling. You're isolated, but you're not. And I think as part of that, you're correct that all the troubles that you have are washed away. And in that moment, you're performing. And you are in a persona, which is what I also found in a lot of talent that I worked with. You're dealing with their persona instead of the real them in a lot of cases. Some people more pronounced than others.
Well, it happens in business. There's a persona. And then when I was actually talking about this on another podcast recently, that if you are a public figure, it could be just in your local business climate, right? It could be LA, it could be anywhere in the world, right? But you've got some kind of public image to uphold. When things start to go rocky in your life, you're trying to hide that. So now you're kind of stepped into this zone of trying to ignore what's going on and hide what's happening instead of maybe dealing with it.
Absolutely. We're stuffing our feelings, and we are also reacting at times versus acting. And I think that those sensations that we get one of the things that just triggered for me in what you said was the experience that I had with my own father, which influenced a lot of my own childhood trauma and set the patterns and programming for my whole life. And I think that happens to most people. And in this case, my father was an outstanding member of the community and was always the people pleaser and the most helpful man out there. Yet within our family and within the four walls of our home, it was a completely different situation. And within my individual relationship with him, it was very different. And I was actually envious of the relationships that he had outside the home with his employees or with the other community members that he supported.
It goes, I was going to
Sorry.
say, then it spirals from there. It does at some point spiral what happens with those kinds of relationships later in life if there's no dealing with it. Even if you can't deal with them personally.
It hit me hard, to your point, and I was actually just going to say this, was at his funeral. While we had a strained relationship, I didn't realize the impact that his death was going to have. Even though it was a bit of a relief because I didn't want him to suffer, it was very traumatic because of the push and pull and the feelings that were associated with not getting what I wanted or what not getting that love and that attention. And that's part of what my book is about. It's going into those deep places that most people don't like to talk about. It's much easier to live in denial.
Yeah, especially if you're male.
Absolutely.
Oh, did I give you a pronoun? I'm sorry. I'm getting so confused. We're allowed to say that, right?
A male, I don't think male is a pronoun, but okay. I have no issue with being cast however people want to perceive me.
Well, you did title your book A-hole. So, but I want to get into the male part of that I think denial happens, or not necessarily denial, but like PTSD, look how long it takes if society is not open its eyes and welcoming to accepting that PTSD is a real thing. It's like addiction. It was like, oh no, we want to ignore the family member that's an addict, which is really stems from an actual issue and oftentimes trauma. If you even look at why we have so many people that are experiencing homelessness across this country, it all goes back to trauma. And an addiction is like here, let me give you this fake medicine so you can forget the trauma, right? And I think for men, it is really difficult, especially sexual abuse, sexual trauma, that kind of thing is kind of a hidden, keep quiet. And I don't know how that happens, if it's just male culture, but I think it hasn't been talked about that much, even as far forward as we are in society, in that we do have pronouns. We are forward, where we are being more sensitive and more compassionate and more understanding, depending on who you are. I should not generalize that. But do you think it's harder for men?
For me, no. But I think for most men, yes. I'm now conditioned to shed those patriarchal traditions. And I am a heterosexual male, which makes it even weirder because most guys don't want to talk about feelings or emotions. I think there are a lot of men that do, but there's fear associated with it because people cast them in a negative light. And that's our society says that you need to not cry, that you need to be strong, that you need to fight. And I'm not saying that society needs to change, but I think people need to change. And each individual can choose whether they want to change or not. For me, there wasn't a choice. I had to change because I probably would have crashed and burned as a human otherwise. I was in too much pain to remain as is.
And then you have to face it and kind of trust yourself, right? Is that where it gets to that point of trusting yourself to handle it?
It's trusting the universe. Absolutely. I think it is. I mean, I believe that each person has the answers within ourselves. And I think the challenge in life is to tune in, to hear the accuracy and it's almost, going back to the days of old radio times, broadcast radio, if we remember the AM radios where you'd get a little bit of static and so forth as you were trying to tune in. And I kind of use that as an analogy for how I've practice tuning in. Is a lot of static that you can pick up, and you don't want to respond to the static. You want to get it fine tuned, and you want to get to the point where it is clear and you can hear each time I've reacted to something in my life where I was really not tuned in, it ended up somehow derailing. I'm not going to say it was all horrible and that could have been my path, but the more I can listen to myself, and I think it's a natural reaction for people to look outside for the answers. If I read this, if I do this, if I take this pill, if I have a cocktail, if I just soothe myself somehow, I can make things better. Sure, there are a lot of methods to soothe oneself that are healthy methods, and then there are a lot of unhealthy ones. And I think soothing is absolutely important, but getting to that place of being able to hear clearly, it's not on the outside, it's here within us.
Well, did that help you write the memoir, or was the memoir, did the memoir help you process what you needed to process?
Both.
Okay.
You know, I think there's pain that comes from writing, and writing comes from pain. It's, you know, for me, it was a combination, and I think the writing was very cathartic and actually has helped me unearth and go far deeper into a lot of areas. But I was already in that process.
Okay.
But the writing was just more detailed analysis. I'm still on that path, and
You should all be there. Yeah. I think that's an important part of life, because it's never it is, I mean, life is just not a bowl of cherries or roses or whatever you want to call it. It isn't, but it is. You know what I mean? We have to, it's kind of like going through grief. I think grief is something you just learn how to work with it and make it, you can't ignore grief. Does that make sense? It's like, it's always going to be there. Once you have grief from a significant loss, you're carrying that around with you the rest of your life. It's just how you work with it. And sometimes it can be a really beautiful thing.
I once wore a shirt that said good vibes only. No longer believe in that. I think that's a spiritual bypass. And so I do believe that human design is not meant to be good vibes only. We're meant to go through hard times, happy times, great times, and everything in between. So it's okay to feel badly, and it's okay to sit through that pain, because it passes. And I think that's the hardest thing. I see that in, not to sound like an old guy, but I do see that in the younger generations, you know, the work-life balance, and, you know, they hit a speed bump and it throws the whole car into a backflip where, you know, in fact, I've had a couple people that are in their early 20s read my book, and it's interesting to see their reaction to it versus somebody that is my age or in my generation, or closer in my generation. Their reaction is usually, wow, it's really inspirational, because I can't believe how you kept getting up every time you fell. I got fired from a lot of jobs, and that comes through in the book. And had a lot of obstacles, and I think everyone does, but it's how we react to them. And I don't know if my sister says, well, you had an angel or you had some higher power looking after you. I don't know if that's true or not, but I believe that somewhere in me was more of the power of survival. And I think that's innate in everyone to do that. But some people give up.
The survivor, and then it's hard to get past the survivor mode. That's the thing. That's where it can get you. And, you know, when you've gone through a lot of significant events in life that are traumatic or cause stress in any way, and they haven't been dealt with, then some people will end up being in survival mode and stay there. So they're always doing something to just get by instead of thrive mode.
Compulsions, I mean, I did that for many years. It was called workaholism. I didn't become a drug addict. I dabbled in a lot of altered states.
Hung out with the Doobie Brothers for real.
Yes, and I smoked a doobie watching them in a rehearsal, and then
that is still classic.
Yeah, and well, I mean, that band in particular, I grew up in Northern California, and the Doobie Brothers were not, quote unquote, the San Francisco scene, because they came after the Haight-Ashbury and Summer of Love, but they were the next generation of that in the 70s. And yeah, so that was like coming home and watching this band rehearse for a reunion tour that I was involved in recording. And the manager passed me a joint, and, that was myself, a friend, and the manager standing there in this studio with just the band and a couple of, techs. And it was really kind of surreal to remember. They were like my first concert, real
Oh, wow.
conscious experience. And so it just took me back. And then that was kind of a bit of a surreal moment. And then, of course, I said, wow, this is really good weed. And he said, well, I can get you some. And then a few days later at the show that I was recording, somebody handed me the weed, an ounce of, like, it's kind of like buying weed from the Doobie Brothers, doobies from the
The
Doobies.
doobies. And it's hysterical because at some point in life, I know we've all made a joke about that. Come on, but you actually did it. That's really funny. I'm sorry. It's just fantastic.
And in the moment, I wasn't even really thinking about it, but that's part of, dredging all these old stories. And then you come back and you think, that was kind of noteworthy.
Yeah, because when you look at, the people that you were, working around, like Tom Morello, right? Like, and, I Rage Against the Machine, exactly. Just think we need him to run for office or something. But when you look at all those events in our lives, and I think that's for everyone, we've all had moments that we sometimes forget. We look sometimes at the negative more than the positives that were there. So I think that's something for us to all look at in life and maybe write a memoir, maybe not necessarily to put out to the world, but to write that kind of thing so that you can look at the good with the negatives. With the learning, I think the negatives are the learning parts because we all have to do that.
I couldn't agree more. It's learn from our mistakes.
Yeah.
And we all make them.
So tell us about the title.
The title is kind of ubiquitous because it doesn't just apply to me. And I used a picture of myself as a young boy on the cover. So the juxtaposition of seeing the word a-hole spelled ASSHOLE on the cover, I think is a bit of a attention grabber. So that's probably the main reason that I chose the title. But then it also applies to my life in the sense that my parents were very amazing people. As parents, I was a little bit neglected. And so from that perspective, they kind of became a-holes towards me. And I had a lot of betrayal as a young boy. So that actually is an a-hole move. And then I was sexually assaulted by people that I entered the radio world. That was sort of a salvation for me. And then I was assaulted there. Well, those guys that assaulted me were a-holes.
Definitely.
And then getting in the entertainment industry through, the long and winding road, I encountered a lot of other a-holes. And eventually it sort of seeps into you. And so I became one myself because that was the behavior that I modeled. And I didn't learn a lot of boundaries or ways to deal with my own, internal abandonment and betrayal and self-loathing I think I lacked even self-respect. And so I was seeking it in all these places. And eventually, I did make a realization that something wasn't right and that I had to do course correction. But that's taken me decades. And
yeah, it's a path. I mean, abuse, it really does get you later in life. I know people who've gone through sexual abuse where, it's like so squished in your memory, like you don't see it and then all of a sudden it's there. And you don't understand why you do certain things, why you're attracted to people maybe you shouldn't be. There's like this weird, until you figure it out, then it's really hard to navigate forward until you figure out the reactions and what happened and all of that. And I think, they say don't blame people, but I like the whole a-hole like category of going, okay, that is that, but also realizing that everybody's in their own stage of growth and everybody has an a-hole time, basically, if that makes sense. It's like we're all, just because, I may be an a-hole right now, but maybe tomorrow I'll start figuring out how to not be an a-hole. So then half the people I think are a-holes may not be as much of an a-hole as I thought. You know what I mean? Because everybody's going through that kind of thought pattern, I think, as we travel through life. As you're going through this process, did you kind of feel a little bit better about the people that you thought were a-holes? Like, not anybody who does sexual abuse, that's a whole different world. But, for people in general.
Well, I think for me, what you talk about, what you're really touching on is empathy for other humans and being able to incorporate that into a mindset. And sure, I have done a lot of forgiving of all of the people, even the people that molested me. I believe that those people had their own baggage that they were carrying that was handed down to them, whether it was generational trauma or they ran into something. Early in this interview, you mentioned, people deal with trauma, throughout their lives. And one of the ways that, look at all the people that are incarcerated. They deal with trauma. And usually that's the reason that they're there. There's something that went wrong in their thinking and their reactions got the best of them. And so they made a huge mistake, some of them breaking the law, and then they were incarcerated. I think that that's at the root of a lot of people. They don't mean to do the things that they do. I didn't mean to treat people poorly, but I did. And I was carrying my own shame. To your other point, when abused, you push these things down inside because you feel shame from them. And I felt like, well, of course, that was partially my responsibility and I shouldn't have allowed that to happen. But I was a boy, and you learn later to forgive yourself too. And so I've had to do a lot of that because I'm angry with myself for allowing it to happen. And not being able to, I've had another friend told me a story after hearing mine and said, well, I had something similar happen, but I ran. And I thought, oh, I wish I would have run. But in my situation, these guys held a job over me. And so that was a huge carrot because that job was my life. I was suffering as a child with a lot of trauma that I talk about in the book. And the job was my way of getting out of that hole.
Right.
And being able to get recognized and get validation.
That's where that survival mode kicks in.
Right.
Then it's like it's hardcore, man. It's hardcore. And I think it's fascinating, when you really start breaking all of that down, because I think it is true. I think everybody has a different level or whatever. Everyone's got a different story, right? And I don't think we live life without having any kind of trauma somewhere.
Right.
Not if you look, even if you're just staying at home, something's going to happen. A bus could drive through your window. I don't know, but something's going to happen. So I really agree with you about like good vibes only. All of that is kind of, it's fa la 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 la. Isn't that kind of the Pollyanna syndrome? Just smile over it, all of that. I wanted to ask you about, is it ACA, which I did not know, the 12-step program. I did not know all of that existed at all. So maybe if you could tell people about that.
Well, I didn't know it existed either. A therapist that I went to for talk therapy, but a lot of EMDR sessions as well, over the course of about 3.5 or 4 years, immediately said, I would like you to consider a 12-step program. At first, hearing that was very off-putting. Almost made me feel like, I had to point the finger at myself and say, well, why do I need a 12-step program? What am I addicted to? And of course, I'd heard a lot of negative things about 12-step programs, which is kind of standard fare. Oh, it's a cult. Everybody thinks the same. Then you're going to become addicted to the 12-step and that and the other thing. Well, I tried one 12-step meeting. I went to a couple of the meetings and I thought to myself, no, this is not applicable to me. I'm not going to say which 12-step it was, but it didn't apply. And she told me, the therapist, it doesn't matter which one you go to, just go to one and try different ones and try different meetings until you find one that feels right. Well, I happened to find ACE, which stands for Adult Children of Alcoholics, although they tack on and dysfunctional families.
Okay.
It applies to almost everyone. I mean, really, the book that they wrote, which is called the Red Book, is the big Red Book. Is the therapists that participated in it, the members that started it. It was started in 1978, and I've been going to it for just short of 3 years. And it's, I think, For me, I can't speak for others, but I find the value in the sense of community, and they call the other members fellows. So it's a fellowship. And, I've heard a lot of amazing stories, and I think that it softens the edges to my own stories by hearing others and realizing that these people are functioning. And actually, strangely enough, but it makes sense after you learn more, these are high functioning people for the most part. Very much all type A's, very successful people in business, making money, living lives with their families. But then something isn't right and they struggle, whether it's with a job, whether it's with their spouse, whether it's with their children, and trying not to pass on the generational trauma to their children. For me, ACA has been an opportunity to learn more about myself through that process. And I don't know how long I will go for it, maybe the rest of my life, but I find it really, I'm very dedicated to it. And I think, you get what you get out of something what you put into it. And
I think this is fantastic for people to know about that may not know about it. I mean, we've done so many interviews on so many things, trauma, all kinds of things, but I've never heard of it. So that's the first person I was like, hey, what's that? When you think about how much dysfunction has gone through generationally because of things that have happened in history. So when you think about all the survival mode, right? If we've gone through people surviving World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, all these wars. I'm just using that as one basic example because it changed the course of life, of how people lived. Things like the Dust Bowl changed what happened to people that may have been jolly, happy, good vibes only, but here comes, we're starving. So are we going to be happy, jolly? No, I don't know how. You can try and keep a smile on your dial and be grateful for the things you like. Hey, I'm awake, I'm awake and the sun is shining, baby hungry, but at least that. So there's that balance. And I think you do need to have hope and gratitude, no matter how bad it is, to kind of count your blessings. Like Willie Nelson says, his life turned around the day he decided to start counting his blessings. I think there's something in that, but you still have to have that balance of reality, right? But I think this is such a cool thing you brought up for people to know about. And so that generational dysfunction I'm talking about has gone down. And now here we are, like you were saying, the younger generation in their 20s and younger. I'm seeing a whole bunch of just take someone off your phone, gaslight, ghosting, whatever the G's are. Here we are, new terms, that it's gone to that instead of resolving. And so relationships are just kind of thrown away pretty quickly from what I'm seeing. And that's even in business. It's like fail forward fast, fine. If a business thing didn't work or a lesson in career, whatever it is, yes, move on quickly, learn your lesson, but they may be closer to just closing a door instead of always keeping bridges,
I think that
I'm scared. It's scary, is my point. Yeah.
Well, it's true. Sometimes around the corner could be the greatest thing ever, but you've hit a stumbling block along the way. And I think that there's aspects of that generation that will just stop right there because they don't want to deal with the obstacle. I mean, speaking from someone, I hit so many different obstacles and got past them. So in business, I had a lot of success. If I had stopped each time I had an obstacle, that would have been far worse, I think, in looking back. But you brought up something that made me think in terms of ACA or generational trauma. I look back on my father, which is a figure that is talked about a lot in my story because he had a huge effect, like many fathers and mothers do on individuals. And in the case of my dad, PTSD, I think, ran in his blood because he ran away when he was a child. And I tell a story about that. And that was due to anti-Semitism. He had running away was not necessarily due to anti-Semitism, but he had a bout with anti-Semitism that hit him very early. Didn't talk about some things in the book. There was another event that happened when he was a small boy that he had told me a story about. And then he was in World War II and he saw friends killed. He was in Okinawa and, under attack. The thing about my father is he never talked about any of these.
Yeah, it's the silent generation.
Yeah. And so those things affected his reactions. And so he was reacting with all that programming, plus the parental childhood traumatic programming where parents make mistakes, and no parent is without mistakes. Um,
Yeah.
that's just part of the game. But I think it's maybe in the future we'll have a situation where emotional and mental health will be a bit different and looked at differently and treated differently. There'll
Yeah.
be looked at. I mean, sure, a lot of people go to therapy and it's much more prevalent and accepted in society now than it ever was, or than it ever has been. And where will it go in the next 20 years or 50 years? I mean, will it be equal to what happens when we have a physical injury? It's very easy to look at a wound and you break an arm or you cut yourself and you can see the wound. But the wounds that are inside our bodies and inside our hearts and our minds are running through us also. And we don't look at those as wounds. So when something happens and it triggers us, it oftentimes is that wound being
giant.
Exactly. It's the wound is just being jostled or scratched and reopened. And it's not even the event that's happening that's really the problem. The problem is the original wound.
Yeah.
To me, that's where the EMDR was very helpful. And people don't want to talk about the past. They don't want to go back there. Oh, that's move on.
Yeah.
Are you living in the past, Rob?
Yeah. Why? Yeah, exactly. I think it's interesting when we talk about those who are incarcerated, right? They go to a correctional facility. What I'd like them to actually do correctional stuff to help, right? So that, this emotional intelligence, and why so many people need life coaches, and because it's these obstacles that eventually everything comes out in the wash. As they always say, you can't sit on it forever. So that wound becomes this big traumatic event. So it's oftentimes later worse than the very original event itself, what sparked that trauma. But your dad is exactly that case I was saying of generational abuse being handed down. Nobody going, hey, I'm going to abuse my son, or I'm going to abuse this person. People aren't thinking that way. It's just how we've all had to carry ourselves to get through things. So I do hope, that in schools that they start talking about emotional health and things like budgeting properly would be good too. And now I think we're getting a little bit better, and there's more tools online, but it's getting them to the right tools and not something that can actually, here, come here, we're going to help you. And it can be a cult. That happens that's the other whole side of this with trauma. Some people end up in a cult-like circumstance through this kind of thing if they don't get the actual help needed. I think that's a scary thing. And what happened.
That might be in the category of quick fix.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't believe there is a quick fix to trauma. I think that people do all kinds of treatments. There are facilities all over the world that will tell you that they can fix this and they can fix that, and read my book and I can fix you, and this kind of thing. I think that's all very interesting. And
put a Band-Aid on it. Yeah.
And it could be helpful in certain ways, depending upon how the person applies themselves and what they do afterwards. And, it can have some positive impact. But really, it takes a lot of hard work to go into understanding what traits we've developed and what traits we relate to and carry forward, and how we're manifesting those in our day-to-day lives, and how they're affecting other people, and then take personal responsibility, not blaming others for our reactions. We play a role in all of that. And something part of why I chose the title also, because I'm taking responsibility for actions in calling myself that in a way.
Okay. Yeah. It's like learning. Yeah. Here's where I was, here's how I'm going to change, because you're doing active steps, like even doing the ACA, that's an active step, right? And that you've been committed to it, which is consistency, which breeds new better habits and ways to working on things. So what have you done, which I know, but what for the audience, what have you incorporated in your life to help you kind of change reactivity to something that is manageable? Because we all kind of have to bring new traits and habits into and routines into our world to make positive change.
So some of the things are, I mean, this is kind of a basic one, but self-care is an important one. And that can mean a lot of different things to different people. For some people, that's getting a massage. For some people, it might be taking a walk. Uh, for me, I like to hike and I like to surf and I like to meditate. So those are some things that I think help calm my nervous system. I've also learned other techniques for that. But I think one of the things you just said is paramount, and that's the consistency of consistently doing things. I have learned tools in ACA and throughout my life. I mean, I think just catching myself with a lot of awareness is probably the biggest thing. And being able to do my own course correction. It might be, was I trying to control the situation? Asking myself that question. People talk about other people. Well, that person was manipulative and they did this on purpose and they were trying to control me. Okay, well, that's fine, but that's really none of your business. It's really, what was your role in that? And
Did you let them? Yeah.
I mean, let's talk about it. Were your boundaries clearly set? Did you say something? Did you communicate how you wanted to be treated? And this is what a lot of people fail to do. I think I could be here for hours talking about all the different things, but it requires a tremendous amount of awareness and then knowing where not to go. And so for me, the real easy ones are, am I blaming someone else? Is there forgiveness here? Am I trying to control the situation? And those are three ways. When you're an animal in fight or flight, you're looking out all of the time for problems and attacks and
Survival mode. Yep.
survival mode. And I lived in that anxious state for decades. And getting myself out of that, part of it is just being able to surrender to whatever happens, whether it's bad or good. And that's the key for me. I try to allow myself to feel whatever it is instead of stuffing it. And then when I am feeling it, understanding what am I feeling and how does this connect back? And there's another part to ACA that is very important. And that's this idea of an inner child and of being the parent to the inner child that is within. And there's not just one child within you. There's stages of your own childhood that are marked within yourself. And this sounds a bit nutty to people that have never heard of this before, but you end up talking to the inner children that are within yourself. You are calming them and you are being the parent that they didn't have. So no longer are you neglected and blaming the parent that you had.
That's pretty good. Yeah.
Care of yourself. Again, taking responsibility. We can do that.
That is a very cool thing. I think that's really cool because for people to be able to, that's like really cognitive therapy because you're being cognitive, you're being aware of it and understanding. It's like people always ask that question of, what would you tell your younger self if you could meet your younger self? It's the same thing, right? It's like, dude, you just stop stressing out. Go for a hike, like you're saying. We'll turn ourselves dizzy. But everything you're talking about sounds to me of someone who is not like, moving around like you're saying, that survival mode where it's on. We become anxious. Where our adrenal glands must be just burned out by now, right? All of us in that mode, going. But now it seems like, let me go through this process before I do something. So you're not being like reactive, right? It's kind of taking control of a situation and choosing and making decisions instead of just leaping on any bus that shows up.
Yeah. One of the things in ACA is acting, not reacting. And I think that, in the first couple months, I kept reading that and what does that mean? But, as you go further into it, it makes such good sense. It's really being able to, I still get angry, but how do I react angry? And where am I focusing my anger and frustration and fear and all those things that go with anger? So,
Yeah.
and I'm not perfect by any means, and I think that it's a struggle at times, but being able, people, I don't even think that I was able to recognize how manipulation is part of control. That was foreign to me. And then I understood, well, wait a minute. To keep myself safe, I'm trying to make things happen a certain way, and I'm forcing them to happen the way I see to keep myself safe instead of letting them happen the way that they are going to happen and recognizing
Yeah.
that. And I
Well,
did
in
that.
business, so that's creating your own opportunity in a way, right? You see what could happen, what it's going to do for you to move something ahead. So that's manipulation, but it's also seeing opportunity. It's kind of a double-edged sword.
Well, there were times where I was signing a big contract or something with an artist, and I thought it was going very well. And then, you'd get a marked up contract back from a very zealous attorney trying to protect their artist, do their job. And it was overwhelming at times. And then I had to ask, do I want to deal with this? Are we just at an impasse here? Or do I want to force each one of these points to try to force it into the situation that I need it to be in order to have the control and necessary aspects? So there's the application of that there. And that's a murky area of when you're pushing too hard and when you just have to give in. I mean, that's probably happening in politics every day. It happens in negotiating every personal relationship. We don't think about it, but that's part of the compromise that we all do.
Speaking of doobies and contracts, you'll appreciate this. So Richard Branson, right, had Virgin Records, and highly recommend his book, his biography, Losing My Virginity is the title of it. And he was talking about, when he first got his very first loan to create a magazine, he went into the bank. He was 19 years old, jeans, no shoes on, and he did manage to get his bank loan, believe it or not. Then he got into the magazine industry and went, oh my God, what am I doing? Why? I know that industry and that's what we're in. And I understand that. What did we do that for? You either have a real passion for it and you'll stick with it if you have a passion for it. But when he went into music, and I can't remember if he was working with another label at the time or he had Virgin Records at the time. I don't have my time frame in front of me, but he was signing Dire Straits for their first album. They were already really grown and big at the time, but Mark Knopfler and his brother and everybody are at a table. They're sitting there ready to sign in some restaurant or something like that. And he goes, oh, well, cool. So he celebrates as a celebration, and they hadn't signed yet, but it was all agreed that they were about to sign. He handed out joints to every single one of them. And Mark Knopfler just looked at him and went, oh, whoa, you want us to be stoned so that we're not cognizant of what we're signing? And took it as a form of distrust. And that was that. No album. And they went somewhere else and made.
They went to Warner Brothers. Yeah.
Was it what you know this story? I'm sorry, you probably.
I'm pretty sure. Well, I don't know that story, but I remember that book when it came out, and I think that I have not read that book thoroughly, but I've thumbed through it before, and I'll have to return to that one.
I might have it wrong. That's what I'm saying. It was years ago when I read that, but
I think they were on Warner, but I could be wrong on that too.
I think something was happening, but that thought of like wanting something to go a certain way. He wasn't reading the room very well at that point, Well,
times have changed. I don't think
that doesn't happen anymore, right?
No, but if you've watched there's a show called The Studio on Apple, and it stars Seth Rogen, and he's one of the executive producers of it. And they do have an episode that is kind of a flashback to, old Hollywood, where they have a party and he's spiked all of the brownies or cookies or whatever that they're eating at the party with mushrooms, and so everybody's having a trip. And then, of course, a couple of the people are not realizing that he's going old school on them, and he thought that they understood the title. It's a good episode. It's a great show, a parody of Hollywood.
Check that out. That sounds like what happened to Gene Simmons, because he doesn't do drugs, and he ended up eating someone's cookies or something that she baked and didn't know they were laced.
I did not know that.
That's a trippy story. And he kept asking for more because he's got a sweet tooth. Everybody else is doing drugs, and all of a sudden he goes up on stage and everything is different to him. And then when he got in the car the limos taking him after the show. He kept making the limos stop because he had the munchies. I think that's funny. But here was this very clean human being, not wanting any of that stuff. But I wanted to go to the music part because you've got playlists. And I always ask authors, like, you've got to have a playlist for your book. And you have two. So up on Spotify that people can connect in, which is pretty cool. Tell us about them.
Well, one playlist is kind of strangely, after I made the playlist, I decided that it's a bit of a soundtrack of my life because it's really every artist that's mentioned or song that's mentioned in the book has a spot on the playlist. And that's very long. And then the other playlist is the chapter titles themselves, which are all song titles. I hate to give that away if somebody hasn't read them. Most people will discover that immediately. Some people maybe not so much, but I'm giving it away.
Okay. Well, everyone, you can go get it, pre-order it. That's the one thing authors love is pre-orders. It really helps books and it really helps authors. So go to robtonkin.com. It comes out July 1st. Again, it's called A-Hole, Wild Stories of Trauma, Truths, and Transformation. And again, the ebook and also the hard copies will come out early August. But I would say go to his website and go from there. You can pre-order it there and Amazon, all those places. But are you going to tour? Are you going to go and do speaking engagements?
I hope so. I'm planning a lot of the book takes place in California. So I will definitely be touring in California. And right now I'm planning to be at the San Diego Book Fair in August.
Awesome.
And so there will be some other things that are being announced as well.
Now, what about book clubs? Do you see this as being a good book for book clubs?
I would love book clubs to read it, but I have no control over that. So if there are people that are in book clubs, I think it would be terrific if they like memoir. A lot of book clubs are not geared towards memoir. I will also say that, as I hate to be divisive between male and female, but most guys don't seem to be into this type of reading. I think it's a much smaller percentage. So there are a lot of female readers that are going to be hopefully interested in my book. And they may get a male perspective, which might be a little interesting and helpful and different because there are tons of memoir written from a female perspective, and most memoirs seem to be written by females.
But on the other hand, it's like such a private thing now. It's like, especially with ebooks, so men may not have read this kind of thing before, but now I think they will. I do. I think it's because it's such a private kind of read that if they've gone through trauma in life and those kinds of circumstances, and even just on the music side, I think you're going to have a bigger male audience than you think. That's just because I know everything, because, I'm perfect. No, I'm kidding.
I hope it's balanced and there's no gender discrimination on any bit of it. I think that it's equally as powerful for a male or a female to read it. And hopefully people find it entertaining and fun. And my story is one that will resonate with others.
I think so. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
I really appreciate the opportunity. And I thank you very much for your time too.
Yeah. Are you going to do another one? Do you think?
Another book? I have ideas for another book. So we'll see, where that goes.
Cool.
I again, kind of going down that river, and I will see where the current takes me.
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio. Keep up with our shows at bigblendradio.com.